The British colonization of the Malay Peninsula was an era of swift and sweeping transformation. But amidst the physical changes, the roads, railways, cities, and towns, there was something subtler and stranger at work, an obsession with recording it all. The British, ever fond of filing cabinets and field notes, could not simply govern, they had to describe, and so they wrote prolifically. Whether they were memoirs, travelogues, ethnographic sketches, philosophical rambles, district reports masquerading as poetry, these colonial texts form a sprawling, sepia-toned mirror of the brave new world they believed they were forging. In them, we find not only vivid portraits of a land in flux, but a far clearer view of the people doing the writing. These books do indeed tell us much about Malaya, but they tell us even more about how the British viewed Malaya, as a mystery to be catalogued, a wilderness to be civilized, or more often than not, a backdrop against which they could reflect upon that grand project known as empire. This video is a quick rummage through 20 books that, in my view, define British Malaya, or at least how the British chose to define it. Some of what we find will be lyrical, some laughable, but all of it shines a light not only on the country, but also on the machinery of empire and the men who oiled it with their ink. Before the days of podcasts, YouTube videos, and Twitter feeds, there was the colonial memoir. Often written under a palm tree, occasionally while suffering from malaria, and invariably with the confidence of men convinced they were both civilizing and documenting the world in equal measure. This is my definitive and mostly irreverent bibliography of 20 books you must read if you truly wish to understand how the British saw Malaya, through polished prose, perspiring brows, and not a little romantic delusion. We start with the first Resident General of the Federated Malay States and the undisputed Lord Byron of British Malaya, Sir Frank Swettenham. Known for his elegant prose, ethnographic observations, and occasional delusions of being Malay, this was a man who could fill 6 pages describing a coconut tree. His works range from charming sketches to full-blown imperial manifestos. He left behind a legacy of florid prose and enduring administrative infrastructure. For example, Swettenham's Malay Sketches, first published in 1895, reads like a poetic saunter through kampong life. The book is a series of fond watercolours rendered in prose, portraying the Malays as gentle, philosophical, and only occasionally murdering the local British administrator. Each sketch feels like a man attempting cultural understanding while being constantly distracted by the humidity. The Real Malay, published in 1900, is in similar vein. It is a bold title, for a man who was absolutely convinced he had indeed met the definitive Malay. It reads like Kipling in a hammock. Part love letter, part field report, all delivered with a self-satisfied puff of his resplendent moustache. Nocturne and Other Malayan Stories and Sketches is the literary equivalent of sitting in a rattan chair on the veranda during a thunderstorm and reminiscing about a bygone kampong romance. This was one of his attempts at tropical fiction, where plot, more often than not, takes second place to detailed descriptions of tree barks at dusk. British Malaya, an account of the origin and progress of British influence in Malaya, published in 1906, was Swettenham's magnum opus, or so he tells us. This is quite unlike his previous works. It is a book in which palace intrigues, trade routes, ferocious battles, and mild self-congratulation blend seamlessly. It is a careful cocktail of administrative pride, colonial justification, and very polite bragging. One can picture him writing it while standing at a map table with one hand on a globe. Swettenham's Perak Journals, 1874 till 1876, were actually published posthumously by the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society in 1975. These journals show a younger, less polished Swettenham, before the lyrical memoirs and glistening moustache wax. These are raw, scribbled dispatches from the field, before his prose was starched and perfumed. They are candid, pragmatic, and occasionally feverish. This is the kind of book where you would find phrases such as bloody mosquitoes or sent tiger head to Penang. We also have his Vocabulary of the English and Malay Languages with Notes, published in 1889. This is possibly the only lexicon that manages to be both linguistically useful and vaguely patronizing. The aforementioned notes are crucial. The word cow is translated, but you can sense from his notes that he will be judging your pronunciation of lembu with the smugness of a colonial schoolmaster. We now come to Swettenham's moodier spiritual twin, the British resident at Pahang, Hugh Clifford, where Swettenham wrote like a man falling in love with a landscape. Clifford wrote like someone quietly breaking up with the empire. His stories are moody, fatalistic, and beautifully written. He was a melancholy administrator who wrote like a disillusioned poet with tropical fever. He firmly believed everyone was doomed, but tried to govern them anyway. Possibly the only man who can turn a quarterly report to the colonial secretary into a tragic novella. For example, In Court and Kampong, published in 1897, is a deeply melancholy tour through Malayan village life by a man who suspects no one in it is truly happy, not even the chickens. It contains more fatalism per paragraph than most of Tolstoy. Clifford introduces us to the shadows behind the empire's sunshine. At the Court of Pelesu and Other Malayan Stories reads like tales told on the veranda at twilight after one too many brandies. It is a fine mix of tribal politics, jungle melancholy, and the occasional ghost. One story even ends without warning, like the monsoon. The Further Side of Silence, published in 1916, has a title that suggests spiritual transcendence, but mostly delivers mosquito nets and ennui. Still, it is a masterclass in imperial gloom, lamented in exquisite grammar. meditations on empire and duty, are seamlessly intertwined with the occasional ghost story and villager transforming into a tiger. Malayan Monochromes was published in 1913, and true to its title, comprises short stories told in grayscale, each one a gloomy meditation on the tragic limitations of man, empire, and district postmasters. Reading this is like overhearing a colonial officer muttering philosophy into his whiskey. Should not be read while operating heavy machinery. Despite the arguably offensive title, Clifford's Studies in Brown Humanity is a deeply earnest tome for what is essentially a man pondering the soul of the East while wearing patent leather shoes. The author does view brown humanity with affection, melancholic reverence, and more than a little projection. He does not see the Malay as he is, but as he needs him to be, tragic, poetic, noble, and vanishing. Clifford wasn't always doom and gloom. As a counterpoint, in his Bushwhacking and Other Asiatic Tales and Memories, published in 1929, Clifford bushwhacks his way through jungle, official protocol, and plot structure, often in that order. This is the literary equivalent of an old man cornering you at the gentleman's club to tell you how he once wrestled a python with monocle firmly in place and cigar still lit. Entertaining, exasperating, possibly exaggerated, but all the better for it. We now come to John Frederick Adolphus McNair. He was a military engineer with a fondness for krises, thinly veiled sarcasm, and casually reorganizing other people's countries. No doubt inspired by his career as superintendent of convicts in the Straits settlements. His book read like a man explaining Southeast Asia to a dinner guest who never asked, and he wrote like the practiced master of strategic overconfidence that he was. In his Perak and the Malays, Sarong and Chris, published in 1878, McNair crashes into Perak like a military bulldozer armed with the first edition of Roget's Thesaurus. This is the literary equivalent of a frontier expedition, rapid, full of bluster, and slightly bewildered by the locals. McNair is far less nuanced than Swettenham, but far more cocky, despite his clear confusion about what a kuris actually does. We next have Isabella Lucy Bird, the ironclad lady traveller from Yorkshire, who wielded a parasol in one hand and a notebook in the other. Fearless, curious, and occasionally oblivious to nuance, she viewed the tropics with wonder, skepticism, and very clean gloves. In The Golden Chesneys and the Way Thither, published in 1883, Bird traverses the Malay Peninsula without a whiff of self-doubt. Armed with keen observation, steely nerve, and probably a concealed hatpin, she offers clear-eyed insights that had probably eluded colonial administrators who'd been there for decades. Bird observes the colonial project as if it were a curious but regrettable fungus. Like its author, this travelogue wears lace gloves but wields a machete. She writes with the calm assurance of a woman who knows she has outwalked every man in Singapore. If Isabella Bird was charmed, Emily Innes was most definitely not. A reluctant expat wife who arrived in Malaya expecting adventure, She instead got mud, regret, and deeply disappointing furniture. Her memoir, The Cheyennes with the Gilding Off, is a masterclass in polite Victorian loathing. Flooded bungalows, insolent servants, and social isolation abound. Think Bridget Jones, but with more mildew and fewer options. Sharp, witty, and often painfully honest, Innes delivers a memoir that accidentally becomes a hymn to colonial disillusionment. Essential reading for anyone who suspects the empire was held together mostly by mosquito netting and passive aggression. We now come to Richard Olaf Winstedt, administrator, scholar, and tireless footnoter of things the Malays already knew. He is hailed as the grand old man of Malayan letters, though one suspects the native Malayans weren't given the opportunity to vote. His obsession with recording the most obscure minutiae can make even tiger hunts sound like parish council meeting minutes. Winstedt's Malayan Memories, published in 1916, is a nostalgic, soft-focused scrapbook of one man's time in the tropics, where every kampong is rendered in sepia, and every tiger shot is accompanied by a philosophical sigh. Winstedt remembers Malaya the way a retired vicar recalls his youthful romps in Amsterdam, with affection, selective memory, and absolutely no mention of the more awkward bits. As a sharp contrast to his Malayan memories, Malaya and its history is a brisk, assured march through centuries of historical Malay drama, with every palace intrigue and dynastic squabble filed neatly under the different ways British administrative logic would have solved the problem. It is occasionally thrilling, though one gets the impression that Winstedt was always convinced that Malayan history only began in earnest when Stanford Raffles got off the boat at Singapore. We now come to John Michael Gullick, the latecomer and most meticulous of the bunch. Gullick was less imperial adventurer, more card catalogue librarian. This man could map all the intricacies of a palace intrigue in 7 footnotes and a coloured chart. He wrote about Malay adat in the same way others write about medieval theology, reverent, exhaustive, and not to be read on an empty stomach. His History of Selangor, 1766 till 1939, is Gullick at his narrative best. Unlike some of his other works, there is no dry taxonomy here, just a richly woven chronicle of power, palace politics, and the occasional bloodbath. It is less like his usual government report, and more like a historical novel. If the novel were written by someone who owned 3 filing cabinets and had a mind that had memorized the Oxford English Dictionary. Sublime, serious, and surprisingly readable. We then have Anthony Burgess, not a colonial administrator, just a schoolteacher marooned in Malaya, with a typewriter, a hangover, and an existential crisis, all of which he turned into literature. Though he would later gain fame for the ultraviolet dystopia in A Clockwork Orange, it was in the sweltering confusion of post-war Malaya that he first learned how to laugh, ruefully, at civilization coming undone. Burgess's Malayan trilogy is his gin-soaked fever dream of Malaya, where every one of his English compatriots is either disillusioned or drinking, often both. The Malays are mystical, the Chinese are moneyed, and the British are morally adrift and perspiring profusely. This book contains fewer tigers than Swettenham, more existential despair than Clifford, and one character even fakes a communist rebellion to get himself posted elsewhere. Surely the most honest act in the book. His prose slinks from satire to self-parody with the elegance of a well-downed whiskey. A fitting end to the series of reviews would probably be an Englishman who earnestly tries to construct definitions of the people, culture, and way of life of the people Britain ruled over. Predictably, this results in a masterwork of confident misunderstanding. Consul, magistrate, journalist, and accidental satirist, Nicholas Belfield Dennis's Meisterwork is a masterpiece of imperial classification, part lexicon, part cultural misunderstanding, part malarial fever dream. It captures the soul of the era by completely missing the point repeatedly. Dennis's Dictionary of British Malaya, published in 1894, offers definitions that are sometimes inaccurate, but always perfectly captures the imperial mindset. Dry, definitive, and frequently untethered from both nuance and reality, it reads like a glossary compiled by a dinner guest who stayed too long, drank too much, and took notes through a monocle. Case in point is its definition of the word amok, which he confidently states as a species of murder madness peculiar to the Malays. And there you have it, clinical observation welded to cultural judgment, delivered with the breezy confidence of someone who has just stereotyped an entire people over brandy and soda. It is both unintentionally hilarious and a devastating artifact of its time, a single line that both reveals and indicts the colonial gaze. So, there you have it, my top 20 books on British Malaya, in all their dated grandeur, flawed charm, and occasional brilliance. To read them is not merely to revisit the past, but to encounter the myths that shaped it. Colonial Malaya, as they saw it, was part Eden, part enterprise, and wholly theirs to narrate. In this modern day, we at least get to read between the lines. So, I would encourage you to brew a strong cup of Darjeeling, adjust your monocle, and dive into those pages. Not necessarily for the facts, but at least for the flavor. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this meander through the Imperial Library, do consider subscribing, liking, commenting, or even sending me your own overblown memoir of a place you barely understood. Until then, cheerio.